Hi everyone, this is Noah Sandler from MTGO Academy, and today I'm going to be concluding my Eternal Masters limited review with the gold artifacts and land cards. So we're going to get started with Armadillo Cloak. It's 1 green, white, enchant creature, gets +2/+2 and has trample, and whenever enchant creature deals damage, you gain that much life. So one thing worth noting is it doesn't actually give lifelink to the creature, so you can play it on your opponent's creature and you will gain life for every damage that that creature deals. So it could be used as a way of neutralizing an opponent's creature, but typically you're going to play it on your creature, either a large creature or a creature with evasion, and just start racing. And if you're gaining life and you're just on a 2/2, you're already draining for 4 every turn, that's really hard to race. So Cloak is a card that your opponent is going to have to deal with at some point, or they're going to lose the game. That being said, it is an aura, and this is a format with Silent Departure, Mana War, etc. There's a lot of removal, and if you play Cloak on a creature and your opponent removes it, you could get 2 for 1. Some of this is offset by the life gain that you get from Cloak, so if you wait until your opponent taps out and you play a Cloak, maybe you'll deal 5 damage and gain 5 life. They'll remove the card, but using a card to drain for 5 isn't the worst thing in the world. And if they don't have removal, it can be really exciting if you pair it with an Ancestral Mask, or put it on a Yavimaya Enchantress, and can just, drain for a ton of life. So there is a cap to this card because it is an aura, but it's still one of the most powerful auras you can get. One other thing that I'll mention, so you can play it on your opponent's creature to sort of neutralize it as an attacker because you gain life. You take the damage and then you gain the life back. But it uses the stack, unlike lifelink. So if you're at 7 and your opponent attacks you for 7, you're going to go to 0, and then the life gain is going to go on the stack, and you're just going to die. You're not going to gain the 7 back. So worth noting that. But otherwise, strong card for green-white, an otherwise relatively weak archetype, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Baleful Strix. Blue-black, 1/1 artifact creature with flying and death touch. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So this is one of the easiest ways to get a 2 for 1 in the format. It costs 2 mana. It's going to trade with one of your opponent's creatures. It has flying, so it could even trade with a very relevant one. And you draw a card when you play it. So it's just remarkably efficient for its cost, and is also in a format with a lot of reanimation and Gravedigger effects. So if you get Strix back after trading it off, you get more 2 for 1s. So it's a really, really nice card. It's a bit unassuming. It doesn't win the game by itself like some of the other gold bombs, but it's just so good for the cost that it's still going to get a really high grade. So I'm going to give it a B+. Next, we have Bloodbraid Elf, 2 red and a green, a 3/2 haste elf with Cascade. So when you cast a spell, you reveal top cards from your library until you hit something that's 3 or less. You can play that card without paying its mana cost, and then that will resolve before the Bloodbraid Elf comes into play. Now, while this card can miss, say you hit a Green Sun Zenith, it has to cast it for 0. Typically, even if you just hit a 1-drop in your deck, if it's a Land War Elves, you're going to be very happy with the value you get from this card. Spending 4 mana for 3/2 haste is below the curve by itself, but it's not terrible. A 3/2 haste for 3 would be quite good. You're paying 1 extra mana to get 1 to 3 extra mana worth of value, and so it's just such a huge tempo swing. And sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll hit something really good. Maybe even a Shardless Agent, which could cascade into another good 2-drop. And this card is also an elf, and so it works great in elf decks, maybe on the splash. So you'll typically be green-black, but you could splash Bloodbraid, but also with Wirewood Symbiote, because you can keep returning the Bloodbraid to your hand and keep getting the cascade effect every single turn. Now, the one thing keeping this card back is that the red-green archetype, I think, is a little weak, but this card is the real reason to go into that archetype in the first place. There are some other nice cards, Curd Ape and Flinthoof Boar, and Rancor goes well in that archetype, but if you can get a couple of Bloodbraid Elves, then you can make that deck really good. So I feel like it is a card that's worth taking early, even though it's not in the best archetype, and I'm going to give it a B+. Next up is Brago King Eternal, 2 white blue for a 2/4 flyer with that's a legend, and when it deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control and return those cards to the battlefield under the owner's control. So this card is already good for its cost. 2/4 flying for 4 is quite solid, and it can become completely broken depending on the other cards in your deck. With just a Mana War, you get to bounce an opponent's creature every turn. With Face Fetters, you can gain 4 life and swap it around. Wall of Omens, draw a card. Gravedigger, get things back. There's so many cool things that you can do with this card. And so some decks it'll be really, really broken in. In others, it'll still be fine. It's a card that you're always going to play if you're blue and white. And it's a flying creature, 2/4 flying for 4, goes well into blue-white by itself, and there's some great come-to-play abilities in those colors. So Brago's going to get a B+. Next up is Dack Fayden, 1 blue-red with 3 loyalty. You can +1 it to make target player draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, -2 loyalty, gain control of target artifact, or -6, you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell that targets 1 or more permanents, you gain control of those permanents. So there are not too many good artifacts worth stealing, so the second ability isn't going to be used too much in this format. But the first ability is really nice. It's in red-blue, which is a very powerful color combination with Burning Vengeance, and there's lots of flashback spells, so drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, you can start filling your graveyard with flashback spells, and also draw you closer to your Burning Vengeance. Dack doesn't protect itself too well, so you're going to need to have some other defense surrounding it if you're going to get up to the ultimate, but it's not that hard to get up there. You're going to be looting through a lot of cards, so it can help you draw answers to anything that would threaten Dack. So this is a Planeswalker that it's not too unlikely for you to actually ultimate. And the ultimate is, of course, very powerful, especially with flashback spells. You get Firebolt and Silent Departure. You can cast out of the graveyard to gain control of your opponent's permanents, and then you'll probably win the game. So yeah, Dack very powerful, just a 3-mana Planeswalker in a good color combination, so I'm going to give it a B+. Next is Extract from Darkness, 3 blue and a black. Sorcery, each player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into the graveyard, then put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So this card is one of the few reanimation options in the format for blue and black, the best colors for reanimation. And Extract is serviceable in that role. It's a lot weaker than Animate Dead. Extract does mill 4 cards and therefore will give you some more choice than Animate Dead, but it's so risky to just cast it if if there's nothing good in the graveyard already. You're not just going to cast it and hope to hit, because you might just miss for 5 mana. So it gives you a little extra value, but it's not a real selling point of the card, the double mill that you get. And on one hand, it is nice that you can steal creatures from any graveyard. There's just a lot of bounce in the format, and sometimes stealing your opponent's creature allows them to just bounce it back to their hand, and that can be really bad. And then you're milling both players 2 cards. That can hit some of your flashback spells, but could also hit for your opponent as well. And overall, I just don't think it's a great format for reanimating because of all the cheap removal that's there. So unless if you're hitting an Inkwell Leviathan, then if you're trying to cheat something big into play, you're still paying 5 mana, you still probably had to do a little work for it, and then your opponent can spend 1 mana or 2 mana on a removal spell, and you put in a lot of work and didn't get too much out of it. So getting back creatures with come into play abilities can frequently be better, but you're spending 5 mana on the effect, so I feel like it's just not very good in this format, but it does give you more options of maybe getting an Inkwell Leviathan out, so it's still a pretty good card, and if you are blue-black, you're probably going to put it in your deck, so I'm going to give it a C+. Next up is Flamekin Zealot, 1/2 red and a white, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain haste until on a turn. So it's really a 3/3 haste, at least on the first turn, then pumps up all your creatures and gives them +1/+1. And it's red-white, so it's in the color with all the tokens, so this can add up to being quite a lot of damage. on the turn after you play it, it'll go back to being a 2/2, but a lot of times it just finishes the game that turn, or sets up a really nice rally turn on the turn after. Because of the double red in its casting costs, it's not a great splashable card, so it pretty much just goes into the red-white token stack, but it's really nice there. So it's not a card I'm going to take super early unless if I feel like I might be tokens already, but in that archetype it's actually really good. So I'm going to give it a B. Next we have Glare of Subdual, 2 a green and a white enchantment, tap an untapped creature you control, tap target artifact or creature. So this was the best limited card in Ravnica, in the original Ravnica, and it is just about up there in this format. It is green-white, which is not the best color combination, and so that's something that's keeping it back a little bit. But there are some good token-making cards in white, and I mean, you only need a couple creatures out for this to be really, really powerful. It just stops everything your opponent's trying to do. Whatever large creature they have gets permanently shut down, and the longer the game goes on, the more value you get out of it, because your opponent will never be able to get value from a large creature, and any creature you draw is going to basically negate any creature that they draw. So the card is extremely powerful. It's one of the few cards that's worth a splash in aggressive decks. So I think it actually is a good idea when it's laid into a pack, and say you're a red-green deck, and you've got to choose between some kind of dual land you might pick up, to consider taking like a Blossoming Sands in case if you open up a Glare, because it's so powerful that even a streamlined aggressive deck is going to want to run it. So like red-white tokens would gladly mess up their mana base a bit to fit Glare in, because it's so good in a deck like that. So yeah, insane card. Yeah, it's an enchantment also, so get some benefit for Enchantress decks, and I'm going to give Glare an A. Next up is Goblin Trenches, 1 a red and a white, enchantment, pay 2, sacrifice a land, put 2 1/1 red and white Goblin Soldier token creatures onto the battlefield. So this is another really broken gold enchantment. In the red-white tokens deck, it just makes lots of tokens. You're already going to play Rally and ways to pump your tokens, so it's really insane there. In a way, it's a little slow. Like, a lot of times you just want to curve out 1, 2, 3, 4, creature, 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 and Trenches doesn't actually fit into that plan, but it's so insane in the late game. If your plan A doesn't work, you have Trenches. It can make so many tokens. You only have to sacrifice 1 land to make 2 creatures. So if you have 6 lands, that's going to be like 10 creatures. You can't sacrifice the last land, but that's a lot of creatures for 1 card to make. And once you're at that point in the game, you don't really need to cast anything out of your hand. So you just keep making tokens and you'll probably win. They block really well, so you can buy time, and then eventually swarm your opponent out. Even in a 4 or 5 color control deck that's not token based, this card is extremely powerful. So you flood out, you've got 8 lands in play, you play Trenches, and it can be so hard to beat. There's not a lot of ways to beat this card if your opponent has a lot of lands. It's one of the hardest cards to beat in the format. So definitely worth splashing, and something that I see go way too late. Just pick it. It's gold, but it's really, really insane. So I'm going to give Goblin Trenches an A. Next we have Maelstrom Wanderer, 5 a blue, red, and a green for a 7/5 legendary creature. Gives creatures you control haste, including itself, and has double Cascade. So you get to Cascade for a 7 or less, and then do it again for a 7 or less. And if you hit creatures off that, they also gain haste. So this is a massive tempo play for 8 mana. Now, yeah, it's 3 colors, and it's 8 mana, so that's pretty intensive, but the effect is so insane. It has such a huge effect on the board the turn that you play it, that not only is it worth 8 mana and the difficult cost, but it's actually worth really distorting your deck in order to fit it in. And I'm a big fan of consistency in decks, but this is a format where there's plenty of gain lands, there's a lot of fixing out there, and by playing multiple colors, you get access to more powerful cards, So every pack that you get past, you can either take the best card in the pack, or you can take some kind of fixing. So you just end up with such more powerful cards in your deck than your opponents, and cards like Maelstrom Wanderer, just no matter where you are in the game, if you're behind, you play this, it can dig you out of a hole, or just put the finishing touches on your opponent. So extremely powerful card, obviously very intensive, but I've been doing very well with 4 or 5 color decks that fit in a Wanderer, so I think it's a card that's actually worth moving in on. So I'm going to give Wanderer a B+. Next up is Shaman of the Pack. 1 black-green for 3/2 elf. When enters the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to the number of elves you control. So by itself, your opponent's going to lose 1 life when you play it. 3/2 for 3 is not a great rate, but anything that's an elf gets a nice bonus in this format. And there's just a lot of elves for black-green. It's not rare to end up with 14 or more in your deck. So without doing too much work, the Shaman could deal 4 or 5 damage and give you a 3/2 for 3 mana, and that's great. And there are some cards that it works very well with, like Lissalana, Huntmaster, Imperious Perfect, and especially Wirewood Symbiote, because you can just keep returning the Shaman, protect it, and return it, replay it every turn, drain for 4 or 5 every turn. The game's going to end really quickly. So it's a very key card for the elf deck, and yeah, it's just one of the best elves you can get once you're in that archetype. It's only good in elves, so it is a bit of a narrow pick to pick it up super early, unless if you think you're just going to be elves at that point. So as far as picking it early in the draft, I'm going to give it a B-, but once you're in the elf deck, it would feel more like a B+. Next we have Shardless Agent. 1 a green and a blue for 2/2 artifact creature with Cascade. So it gets out a 2-mana spell to play when you cast this. So a 2/2 for 3 is not a great rate, and it is worse than the 3/2 haste that you get from Bloodbraid Elf from a vanilla test perspective. But you know, it is potentially 5 mana worth of stuff. I mean, you basically pay 2 mana for 2/2, and then you might get a 2-drop, so you're getting either 3 or 4 mana from the agent. And of course, it really depends on the cards that you're actually going to hit with it. So based on your deck, it could be not that great, or it could be really good. If somehow you can hit a Hymn to Torok, then it's insane, or just a Llanowar Elf is great. But the more cards you have, like Counterspell, you end up having more potential misses, and so it becomes not as good there. You may want to cut some of your counters if you've got a lot of 2-mana counters and you're going to run Agent, so you don't run into that issue. But most of the time, it's just a very solid card, giving you a 2/2 plus maybe a mana producer or something else of value for 3 mana. So very solid. I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Sphinx of the Steel Wind. 5 a white, blue, and a black, 6/6 artifact creature with flying, first strike, vigilance, lifelink, protection from red, and protection from green. So if this is in play, every single turn you attack with it, you can block with it, you're draining life every attack, you're draining life every time it blocks, and it will end the game if your opponent doesn't have an answer to it. They can't go wider than this card. Just blocking, killing their biggest creature, and gaining 6 life basically eliminates that option. Now, the 8 mana that it costs it's pretty expensive, though certainly worth it, and it is in colors that can reanimate, and that makes it one of the best reanimation targets in the format. Not quite as good as Inkwell, I would say, in most matchups, but I mean, if you're facing a red-green deck, then it's just completely unbeatable. But the problem is, there are 3 other colors in Magic, and they all have a decent amount of removal, so Eyelight's Ending, Pacifism Swords, Mana War Silent Departure, Control Magic. There's just a lot of stuff that can actually remove it, so it's very matchup dependent on how good it's going to be, but I mean, it's just so insane if it stays in play that it's still really powerful, and I think it's worth picking up early and maybe going into a control archetype or doing something reanimating to make it good. So I'm going to give Sphinx a B-. Next up is Thunderclap Wyvern. 2 white and a blue for a 2/3 flash flyer, and it gives other creatures you control of flying +1/+1. So 2/3 flyer for 4 is not great. You give it flash, it's actually pretty decent. And then other creatures you control of flying get +1/+1. That's really good. You can have a deck with basically all flying creatures in blue-white. So it's going to be a glorious anthem, plus giving you a 2/3 flyer. Multiple wyverns pump each other. You get cheaper from Warden, so it's an amazing card in the blue-white flyers deck, and can also be played as a combat trick. So you can attack with some Squadron Hawks, and your opponent makes some blocks with 2/2 flyers. You get to play Wyvern and clear the board. I had an amazing play. My opponent played Toxic Deluge to clear my board of 1/1 flyers, and they played it for 1. So I played Wyvern, and all of my guys survived. So it's a top pick in the blue-white flyers archetype, and if you see it, might be worth giving it a go and seeing if that archetype is open. But also consider if you're playing against the blue-white flyers deck and your opponent just passes with 4 mana up. It could be a Factor Fiction, but a lot of times it will be a Thunderclap Wyvern, and you want to make sure you don't get wrecked by it. So be careful attacking like important 1/1 creatures into that open mana, and consider maybe going a little bit higher on a Toxic Deluge if your opponent has a bunch of small flying creatures to play around it. So I'm going to give Wyvern a B-. Next up, Trygon Predator, 1 green blue for a 2/3 flyer. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So 2/3 flyer for 3 mana is very good. And that ability is potentially really, really good. So sometimes this card is going to be amazing. Your opponent pacified one of your other creatures, you follow up with a Predator, you get to eat the pacifism, your opponent has to deal with the Predator and the creature that was pacified. It also eats up Hondens and some of the broken enchantments that are out there, like Goblin Trenches. But there are a couple problems with the card. While in a vacuum, it's just a great card. Blue-green isn't that great of an archetype, and it doesn't do anything for the blue-green threshold archetype other than just being a good creature. It doesn't get you any closer to threshold. And also, a lot of times, if it's going to end up being really good, your opponent will use a removal spell on it. And while that's usually not a reason to, not play a creature, if you're going to try to side this in because your opponent has some Hondens and this is going to be your answer, it's not going to be as consistent as, say, a Nature's Claim. So if your opponent removes it, then I guess you just don't have ways to deal with the Hondens. So it has a higher upside because you get the creature out of it and can eat multiple enchantments, but it's more likely to just get removed and your opponent's left with all their enchantments in play. So considering all that, I'm going to give it a B-. Next is Vindicate, 1 a white and a black sorcery, destroy target permanent. So super simple, kills anything on the board for 3 mana at sorcery speed. That's great. So it can kill enchantments. A lot of times you'll use this on a Honden, and it kills large creatures. Yeah, pretty much does everything. Sometimes you could kill a land if your opponent's mana screwed, though typically I think it's better reserved just to wait for your opponent to actually play their biggest threat before using it. So, only knock on the card, it's black and white, so you either want to be like 3 colors. I mean, it's a card that's worth splashing, or being in the black-white archetype, which overall is a bit weaker than the other archetypes. So yeah, that's the only thing holding it back, but it's still a card that's worth first picking or taking early in a draft and trying to make it work. So I'm going to give Vindicate a B+. Next up is Void. 3 a black and a red, sorcery, choose a number, destroy all artifacts and creatures with converted mana cost equal to that number, then target player, your opponent, reveals his or her hand and discards all non-land cards with converted mana costs equal to the number. So it's a pretty complicated card. For starters, let's just say it's a good card. So for 5 mana, a lot of times you're going to kill 1 permanent, and you get to look at your opponent's hand, and some of the time you'll be able to force them to discards that have similar casting costs to that permanent. That's the typical use of it. Now, it's interesting because, for one, worth noting, it doesn't hit enchantments. So you're not going to be able to hit Hondens unless if they're in your opponent's hand. and you get lucky. But it does kill artifacts and creatures, but it kills them for both players' boards. So you're not necessarily going to be able to 1-for-1 with it. If both you and your opponent have good 4-mana creatures out, you'd have to kill all the creatures in play in order to use the Void. So it does take a little bit of finesse, but if you play it right, if you time it right, sometimes you can get 3-for-1s or more off of the card, and typically you're going to be able to just kill your opponent's biggest threat for 5 mana, and that's okay. But it has some nice upside too. You can remove a bunch of tokens, and sometimes against like an elf deck, if you do it for 3, you hit the Timberwatch, you hit the Imperious Perfect, a Wayfinder, maybe an Elephant Guide in their hand. So it has a very high upside. So it's a card that's very powerful, worth splashing. So I'm going to give it a B. Next up is We Dragonauts. 1 a blue and a red, a 1/3 with flying, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So the body, 1/3 flying for 3, is overcosted. You'd pay about 2 mana for that. But any instant or sorcery spell gives it +2/+0 until end turn, so that makes it a 3/3 flying for 3, which is very good. So if you're in an archetype that plans on playing lots of instants or sorceries, which happens to be the red-blue archetype, then this is very good with just casting 1. And red-blue has a lot of flashback spells, so you can frequently be casting multiple spells per turn. And there's also a couple retrace cards, Una's Grace and Flame Jab. So if you Flame Jab something 3 times in a turn, you're going to give the Dragonauts +6 power, and that can just be 10 damage to your opponent's face. And this card gets better with card draw, with deep analysis, so you're cheap flashback, just 2 mana, you pump up your Dragonauts, you draw more cards, you cast more spells, you get more flashback cards in the graveyard, and you just keep the engine going, and it can deal a lot of damage. And I really like blue-red, Burning Vengeance. I think it's one of the best archetypes in the format, and yeah, I mean, if you don't end up with Vengeances, having a couple Dragonauts might allow you to win the game anyway. So yeah, very solid card for the archetype, but has no real use outside of it. It's not a card you're going to splash in a 3 or 4 color deck, so I'm going to give it a B-. Next we have Zealous Persecution. It's a white and a black for an instant. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1, and creatures your opponents control get -1/-1. So it's an instant speed nausea, so against token decks, that effect's going to be really good. And also giving your creatures +1/+1 means that besides just killing 1 toughness creatures, this allows you to have a really nice combat. So if you're going to have a lot of creatures in combat, this is sort of going to give all your creatures +2/+2, which is, yeah, a really nice effect. It's not as good as an overrun for just getting in lots of damage, because you're only getting +1/+1, but for creature combat, it's like giving +2/+2 to all your creatures. Now, unfortunately, I haven't had too much success with white-black as an archetype, and you want to make this card good, you either need to face a tokens deck, a deck with lots of 1 toughness creatures, where a nausea would already be very good, or you want to have a lot of creatures yourself. And I haven't drafted too many white-black decks with lots of creatures, and if you're 3 or 4 colors, you're frequently not going to end up with enough creatures to get value from Persecution. So I feel like it is a very nice card that doesn't have a great place. I feel it's unlikely that you're going to get full value for it. But if you do get the deck that has lots of creatures and you expect to do creature combat, do a lot of trading, then I think it actually is a very good card. But it's not something I'm picking highly, and I think they'll go pretty late, because I don't think white-black's a very popular archetype. So I'm going to give Persecution a C+. Now we're on to the hybrid cards. There's called the Skybreaker, 5 blue-red, blue-red. I don't know how to say that, but sorcery, put a 5/5 blue and red elemental token with flying onto the battlefield, and you can retrace it by discarding a land and paying 7 mana. So the first time you use it, you get a 5/5 flyer for 7, and that's definitely overcosted. About 6 mana would be right, but it gives you the ability to just turn any land for the rest of the game into another 5/5 flyer. So once you cast this, for the rest of the game, you're either drawing a spell, which is good, or you're getting a 5/5 flyer, which is actually better. So this is really nice for any deck that's going to go long. And it's hybrid, so you can play it in any red deck or any blue deck. Though if you're red-white tokens, the more aggressive decks, the card's just too expensive to run. So it's more for controlling decks, like a 4 or 5 color control deck. This would be a great card to have in, and also the Burning Vengeance decks, because you're going to be cycling through your deck a lot, and the games tend to go pretty long, and this can be a good finisher, especially if you don't end up with Burning Vengeance. So yeah, I mean, it's an expensive card, but it is going to win the game for you if you get to the late game. So I'm going to give it a B. Next up is Deathrite Shaman. It's a green or a black for a 1/2 elf. You can tap it, exile a land from a graveyard to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. You can pay a black, tap it, exile target instant or sorcery from a graveyard. Each opponent loses 2 life. Or green, tap, exile target creature from a graveyard. You gain 2 life. So unless if one player is looting a lot or self-milling, it's not that common to end up with lands in the graveyard, so you're not going to treat Deathrite as a consistent mana source like a Llanowar Elves, like you might in Constructed. But the other 2 abilities can be really nice. I mean, you're getting a 1/2 for 1, and that's not a great rate, but honestly, it's an elf, and I think just running a blank elf that's a 1/2 for 1 mana is something that a lot of the elf decks would actually play. And it's green activation, exile a creature from a graveyard to gain 2 life. That can be really nice against decks that are trying to reanimate. You just leave up Deathrite, and your opponent just blanks Gravedigger, Animate Dead. So in the right matchup, that can just be really powerful. And if you're not facing those cards, then still it just gains you extra life over the course of the game, and that can definitely add up. And then the black ability is also it's actually very powerful. So draining your opponent for 2 every turn in a long game can really add up and can be a win condition by itself. And it also lets you remove flashback cards from your opponent's graveyard. And so your opponent will probably just be flashing back things immediately, but that forces them to do that. So if they have a Silent Departure in their yard, they probably just have to use the flashback on your Deathrite Shaman. Otherwise, you're going to eat it and drain them for 2. So it puts your opponent in a tough spot. So I mean, it's good against blue decks pretty much, either Reanimator or with flashback cards, and it's just fine on its own. Plus, being an elf, so just a very solid card. If you can use both mana abilities, if you can just use one, it's not as good, but it still would probably be better in black decks. But yeah, so yeah, just good card. I'm gonna give it a B. Next we have Giant Solifuge, 2 and 2 red-green hybrid. It's Trample Haste 4/1 with Shroud. So this is a very high variance card. It seems simple, but it is very situational. If your opponent has a 1/1 creature out, the Solifuge is pretty bad. I mean, not terrible, but you're going to play this card in aggressive red-green and red-white decks. So any aggressive deck that can cast it, you're going to play it. But if your opponent just trades a small creature for it and takes maybe 2 to 3 damage, that's not really great for 4 mana. But if you're fortunate enough that your opponent does not have any blockers up and you get to land Solifuge, then your opponent takes 4 damage, and then they have to trade with it. And then they might have to take extra damage, and you get the 1/1. So it can be amazing in those situations. And also, it's not bad as a blocker. So it has Shroud, opponent can't target it, and that means it's going to trade with something with 4 or less toughness over the course of the game, assuming your opponent actually has a good block for it when you first play it. So yeah, it's kind of high variance, but I think the aggressive decks in this format just want to take chances at being able to finish your opponent off quickly, and this card can definitely do that. And if your opponent's playing a deck without many creatures that's more removal based, this card can be really tough for them to deal with. So yeah, it's a high variance card, which means as a good player, you're going to try to devalue these cards a little bit, but I feel like it does enough for the archetypes that want it, so I'm going to give it a C+. And lastly, for hybrids, we've got Torrent of Souls. It's 4 and a black-red hybrid sorcery. Return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield if black was spent to cast it, and creatures target player controls get +2/+0 and gain haste until on turn if red was spent to cast it. So you're not going to play this in a non-black or red deck. Maybe in an extreme reanimator deck with Inkwell and a ton of ways to get creatures in the yard, and you didn't end up with any reanimation options, then yeah, I guess you could play it there. But basically it's a black-red card, and you're going to get the 1-for-1 of getting your creature out of the graveyard, but also pumping up all your creatures and maybe getting a big attack. And there are some cards that this is insane with. Send your Autocrat, Siege Gang Commander. It'll bring back those creatures, pump them up, and give all the creatures that they bring back haste and +2/+0, so you can attack for a ton of damage. And it also pumps the creatures that you already had in play, so it's a really swingy card. And yeah, can be very powerful in the black-red sacrifice deck. It does cost 5 mana, and there are a decent number of good 5-drops in the format in those colors. But yeah, just still has a really high impact and can win games out of nowhere, and has some really nice combos too. So I'm going to give it a B. Okay, on to artifacts. We have Ashnod's Altar, 3 colorless artifact, sacrifice a creature, add 2 colorless to your mana pool. So I think this card is basically useless in this format. There's not that much to ramp into, and I mean, there are creatures that you get benefits from sacrificing them, but there are just better ways to sacrifice them, because this is, you're paying 3 mana, you're getting a card that doesn't affect the board, and then I mean you have to sacrifice another card to start getting value out of it. So yeah, I just think the card sucks, and I'm giving it an F. Next up is Chromox 0 for an artifact with imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile a non-artifact, non-land card from your hand. You can tap it to add 1 mana of the exiled card's colors to your mana pool. So I might be lower on this card than other people, but I just don't like taking a 2-for-1, to get 1 mana source. Yes, I understand that this can make for some really explosive draws where you start with a 2-drop on turn 1, and then a 3-drop on turn 2, and a 4-drop on turn 3, and then you win. I mean, if your hand is... It sounds like you had a really insane hand to begin with, and maybe if Chromox was something else, you might have been winning anyway. But if you get a bad hand, you have a Chromox, it's pretty close to a mulligan. And getting a bit of speed in this format, I think, is just not worth that much investment. I've won a lot of games where my opponent puts out a Chromox, removing a relevant card, and cast something a turn early, and then they just peter out because they had to remove that extra card from their hand. So for myself, even in the kind of decks that this would be good in, which is basically aggressive decks that you want to curve out and would prefer starting on 2 mana, I still don't really like the card. But I've heard other people say that they like it in those types of decks, so I'm not going to say I might try this card, and I think it is kind of high variance. So if my deck was weak and aggressive, I think I'd be more likely to run Chromox. But as is, I'm not a fan, and I'm going to give it a D+. Next up is Duplicant. 6 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature with imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile target non-token creature, and as long as a card exiled with it is a creature card, it has power, toughness, and creature types of that creature card, and it's still a shapeshifter, for whatever that means. So Duplicant is colorless creature removal. It kills any non-token creature, exiles it so it can't be reanimated again, and becomes as large as that creature. So sometimes it's going to end up bigger, sometimes it'll be smaller than the 2/4, but you don't really mind whatever happens, because you killed a creature and you got a body out of it, and that's definitely worth 6 mana. Necrotal is really insane for 4 mana, you get the 2 and first strike, and this is usually going to give you a better body back for attacking or trading with at that point in the game. And yeah, a Duplicant, just like Necrotal, could also be reanimated, get it back with Gravedigger, White Mane Lion, to be able to reuse it. So it's just a great card, and the best thing about it is that it's colorless. So if you're in a draft and you open a pack with a Duplicant, it's really hard to justify taking anything else over it, because you're going to play Duplicant in 100% of your decks. It's just not a card that you're going to cut. Even in an aggressive red-white tokens deck, I'm still running it, and it's just going to remove my biggest, the opponent's biggest blocker and give me a good-sized creature. So you're just playing it in every single deck, and it's going to be strong in every single deck, and that gives it a lot of value as a high draft pick. So I'm going to give Duplicant an A-. Next we have Emmessi Tome for an artifact. You can pay 5 tap to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. So that is a nice ability. Being able to draw 2 cards and discard a card every single turn can give you a lot of card advantage and card selection over the course of the game. So that's really nice. But what about the cost? You've got to pay 4 to cast it, and you have to pay 5 to activate it. So that means you're paying 9 mana before you get to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. And you're spending a card to begin with. So after the first activation, you're still even on cards. Wow, that is expensive. What is your opponent doing that you're able to just sit there spending 5 a turn to start card selecting? So I just don't think that this is a card that you can play. I have had someone get me with this card. They played the Tomb with 1 card in hand. They played Balance, destroying my hand and my board, and then they had the Tomb going, and I wasn't able to beat the card advantage at that point. But that's such an extreme example. Usually your opponent's going to have a board, they're going to have cards in hand, they're going to keep playing cards, and it's just such a tempo loss to pay 9 mana just to start some card filtering. Compare it to Deep Analysis. Like, you're getting so much more value from a Deep Analysis. Even though in a long game, theoretically you can draw lots of cards off this, it's just so overcosted. So it's not a card that I'm ever going to play, and I'm going to give it a D-. Next we have Goblin Charbelcher. It's 4 colorless artifacts, pay 3 tap it, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. It deals damage equal to the number of non-land cards revealed this way to target creature or player. If you revealed a mountain as the land card, then it deals double that damage. And then you put all the cards on the bottom of your library in any order. So with this card, you have to choose the target first, so you don't know how much damage it's going to deal before you choose the target, meaning you might pick a creature with 3 toughness, and then you hit for 2. You can't then throw the 2 damage at your opponent's face. You basically just missed. So the safest thing to do with a card is just aim it at your opponent's face every single time. If you're about to die and the only way you can win is removing your opponent's 5/5, then I guess you have to go for the 5/5. But typically, you're just going to throw it at your opponent's face every turn. Now, if your deck doesn't have mountains, then I feel like it's just not doing enough. You're paying 7 mana before you get your first belch, and if you ever hit a land, then you just bricked for the turn and it didn't do anything. Now, there are some matchups and situations where just having that repeated value every turn of just pay 3 mana, belch your opponent, that could be enough to just win you a grindy game. So I think it could have some value in grindy matchups, but if your opponent's aggressive, you're just not going to have enough time to activate it, and trying to use it on their creatures is just too random. But if you are a red deck, even in a split red deck, so you've got half mountains, I still don't think the card is that good. It's just a little too unlikely that you get a big hit off of it. But if you are mono red, so you're playing all mountains, then the card's quite good. Once you're doubling the damage every single time that you hit, just playing Charbelcher and aiming at your opponent's face every single turn is probably just going to win the game. So, great card for mono red. Barely playable, I think, for decks that just have some red, and better in grindy matchups, but overall I'm going to give it a C. Next up, we have Isochron Scepter. It's 2 mana artifact with Imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile an instant card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand. You can pay 2 mana, tap it to play a copy of the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So worth remembering, it only works for instants, so you can't do this with sorceries, and you have to draft a good number of instants to actually make this card work, because it's a dead card if you don't have instants. And then you need instants that you're going to want to play every turn. So the best ones are counter spells, and you can kind of lock your opponent. Memory Lapse also works great. Swords to Plowshares is amazing, and Tragic Slip can be good. So these are already cards that are relatively high picks. So if you can pick up a few, I feel like 3 is the number that you want in order to play this card. If you just play 2, I think it's going to be a dead card too often. And remember that if you don't draw your Scepter and you have one of the instances in your hand, you're going to be tempted to actually just cast it. You're not going to just wait on drawing the Scepter. So, even if you would end up drawing both cards, you may have not been patient enough to actually get the value out of the Scepter. So it could be a dead draw in the late game. But there's also a couple other effects that are normally bad but are good with Scepter, and I think the best one of that is Fog. So a card that you're not going to play ever on its own, but with Isochron Scepter, it means your opponent never deals combat damage to you for the rest of the game. And there aren't that many ways of dealing with artifacts, and there's not that many ways of killing people without creature damage. So that will just buy you a ton of time to set up your win condition and win the game. So with Scepter, I think Fog can be a reasonable card to play. But yeah, just have at least 3 good targets for it, like counters, swords, Tragic Slip, and I think you'll be fine. And it can be an extremely powerful card. So even though it's high variance and you do have to draft around it a bit, I think the value is there, so I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Juggernaut. 4 colorless for a 5/3 artifact creature. It attacks each turn if able, and it can't be blocked by walls. So it's pretty reasonable for the cost. 5/3 for 4 mana is pretty good. There's just a lot of 2/2s in the format, so this can frequently take 2 creatures to trade with it. But because it has to attack each turn if able, sometimes your opponent could play something like a Baleful Cohort, a 3/3 first strike, and then you're forced to just trade the Juggernaut into it. So the more removal spells you have to back up the Juggernaut, the better, the more safe it's going to be. And yeah, like it's decent. Like the red-white tokens deck just wants cheaper creatures to go wide, so it's not too interested in Juggernaut, and it's not a control card since it has to attack every turn. So there's not a ton of decks that are really happy to play it. Maybe like black-white, the black decks that are more aggressive, maybe the red-black sacrifice deck. But so far I haven't been too impressed by Juggernaut in this format, so I'm going to give it a C. Next up we have Mana Crypt. It's 0 mana for an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, it deals 3 damage to you, and you can tap it for 2 colorless mana. So this is one of the most broken cards ever made in Magic. It's a really high pick and cube. It's run in any constructed format that it's legal in. So just super, super broken card. But I don't actually like it that much in this format. I think there'll probably be people who will strongly disagree with me, talk about how insane it is. You get the 2 mana every turn from this one card. Like it just doesn't matter how much damage you take. I don't think it's as good here as it is in Cube. In Cube, it is one of the best cards to take, but Cube is a format where you've got these insane 4 mana, 5 mana planeswalkers, accelerating out these super, super powerful cards out before your opponent can respond with counter magic or their answers or threats, and it becomes really broken, like the other cards that you have in the deck to support it. But I don't think that that's the case in this format. It's a very value-driven format. You're playing a lot of 2/2s, and I mean on 4 mana you can cheat out a Beetleback Chief, maybe a Honden you could get out early. But I think a lot of games just end up becoming grindy, and in a grindy game, let's say you use Crypt and you get to play 1 or 2 things a little earlier than you might have otherwise, but then your opponent recovers, and again, there's so much cheap removal. Okay, you play a great 4-drop and then they pacify it. Now you have a card in play that on average is going to deal you 1.5 damage every turn for the rest of the game. So that can just kill you. And I mean, as the game goes on, and you can also get unlucky. I mean, it's a high variance card too. So sometimes you're just going to take 3 damage every turn, and you just die. Like a game that you shouldn't possibly lose, this card deals you 12 damage, and your opponent is able to just, finish you out with bolts. So I think this card is just really poorly positioned in this format. As powerful as it is, and, even still, there will be some insane draws that you get, and you just go 3-drop turn 1, 4-drop turn 2, 5-drop turn 3, and then it wins the game for you. And yeah, it's a really broken card. But I just think that it's not a good fit for this format, and it's just so risky to actually play it. It's going to take the slot of one of your lands, since it adds mana. But if you have a land heavy hand and maybe you just have one thing to excel out, then you play the Crypt, and okay, you excelled out by 2 turns, you get to cast one thing, but then you're just taking 1.5 damage for the rest of the game. It's so punishing. So the reason why I don't give it a truly low grade is because I think it does have a place in the very aggressive decks. So red-white tokens, red-green beats. I think red-green beats is probably the best place for it. But in decks that you're just focused on taking your opponent down to 0 quickly, and you're not so concerned about your life total, then getting access to 2 colorless mana starting turn 1 of the game is actually quite good and is therefore worth it. So because of that, I'm going to give it a B-. I think in aggressive decks it can be very good, but I think if you just jam this into your average deck, I think you're going to be disappointed. Next up is Millikin. 2 colorless for 0/1. You can tap it to put the top card of your library into your graveyard and add a colorless mana to your mana pool. So this card helps you ramp from turn 2. You can play a 4-drop on turn 3. And it also puts cards into your graveyard. So if you're playing with Flashback, Reanimator, it can help enable those. It gets you to Threshold pretty quickly as well. So it's really nice in those decks. And if you just have a high curve and don't have much going on in the early game, like a red, black, white control deck, then I think it's fine to play there and just help you get to your bigger mana cards more quickly without being as risky as a Mana Crypt. Now, one thing you do have to consider is if you just use it every turn for the whole game, it is going to mill a good number of cards from your library, and decking could end up mattering at some point. But if you don't think decking is going to matter, then there's no real cost to milling cards from your deck. Though be aware, if you have like a Civic Wayfinder and you have one swamp in your deck, if you mill that swamp, now Wayfinder isn't going to be able to find black mana. So there are some costs if you have deck searching cards to running the Millikin. But overall, yeah, just a solid card. You can play it in most decks and is going to be pretty good in decks that can take advantage of it. So I'm going to give Millikin a C. Next up is Mindless Automaton. 4 mana for a 0/0 artifact creature. Enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters. You can pay 1 mana, discard a card to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can remove 2 counters to draw a card. So this card used to be insane when damage stacked, so you could deal the damage and then draw cards off of it. So it was really, really good back then. Now that you have to make the choice of either dealing damage or removing counters, it is a good deal weaker. So this is not an auto-include in every deck like it used to be, but it's still a pretty nice card. It is a discard outlet, so if you're trying to reanimate, then this enables that, or for threshold decks. But the card can also be reasonable just as a 2/2. If your opponent taps after a creature, you can attack the automaton into their creature. To your 2/2 into the 3/3. If they block, you discard 2 cards. You make it a 4/4. And so you kill the creature, you lost 2 cards, but now you have a 4/4 that if they try to remove, you can draw 2 cards in response. Or you can attack with it again, and if they try to double block, you can threaten to discard more cards. So a lot of times they'll just take the damage turn after turn. So I think the card plays better than it looks, but is just not a card that you really have to play if you're not taking advantage of it synergy-wise. So I'm going to give Mindless Automaton a C. Next is Nevinyrral's Disc. 4 colorless mana for an artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 1, tap it to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So this card can give you a slightly delayed wrath effect. So if you're facing tokens decks or just any creature-based deck that's trying to kill you, you play the Disc. They get 1 more turn to attack you for a bunch, and you can chump block with whatever you have in play, and then you can pop the Disc. So that's a simple way to use it. It also hits enchantments, so it'll kill Hondens and deal with some of the really broken cards in the format. But that's not the only way to play it. I think that you can gain a lot of value out of putting the Disc down and just seeing how your opponent reacts to it. Because a lot of times your opponents will assume that you're going to pop it. Like if they are ahead on board, they're going to assume that you're just going to use it the next turn, and so they're just going to sit back and do nothing. But what if instead you play a medium creature after the disc? Then they have to decide, am I going to now put more creatures in play? Do I use a removal spell on the medium creature? Like, do I just sit here and do nothing? And it's very easy for your opponent to make mistakes when you have the option of whether to use the disc or not. So if you just leave it in play and you force your opponent into this guessing game of when you're going to use the disc, and they have to not overcommit but not undercommit either, and then you can still play out some marginal things and just keep the board kind of similar and just wait around, and eventually you find the right moment and you get to use the disc. And sometimes you might not even need to use the disc. Just having it out there allows you to put enough creatures in play that you just put enough pressure on your opponent and you never have to use the disc. Now, I mean, it's certainly weaker in decks that want to play a lot of Hondens, because you don't want to have to lose your Hondens ever. But it's colorless, so it can play in any deck. If you're really aggressive, you don't really want this effect in your deck. But for control decks, it's a really strong card. So I'm going to give it a B+. Next we have Pilgrim's Eye. It's 3 colorless for a 1/1 flying artifact creature. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. So it's like a Civic Wayfinder, except you get a 1/1 flyer instead of a 2/2, and you don't have to have green mana to first cast it. So if you're playing a multicolored deck, if you don't have your green mana, you can't actually cast the Wayfinder, but Pilgrim's Eye you can cast as long as you have 3 colorless to use. So since it's a not great body, you're not going to play in aggressive decks, but I think it's an okay card in just any control deck or mid-range deck, just giving you sort of a 2-for-1. Your opponent might need to deal with your 1/1 flyer at some point. Maybe it could trade off with something small or just poke in for a few bits of damage, and you get the land out of it. But it's really great in decks that are 4 or 5 colors, just getting you the fixing that you need, while also giving you a body. So yeah, just very solid card, something I'm never really unhappy to run in just about any deck, but also not particularly insane. I think it's pretty fairly costed, so I'm going to give it a C+. Next card is Prismatic Lens. It's 2 colorless artifacts, tap for a colorless mana, and you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this helps you ramp from, you play it turn 2, you get to play a 4-drop on turn 3, so that's pretty nice. Because it is not a creature, you can also sequence it when you're casting something else that turn. So on turn 4 you can play Lens and then play a 3-drop, and then you'll have Lens up for the next turn. So sometimes it'll just cost 1 mana to get it into play, and then the other ability, being able to pay a mana and turn it into a mana of any color, is quite nice to have. If the more colors you're playing, I mean, you're making the card that you're casting cost 1 more mana, so it won't be as efficient, but being able to cast a card, especially on a splash color, usually they're going to be more powerful, so they might be worth paying extra mana for. So it's great in like a 4 or 5 color Honden deck. So yeah, the more colors you're playing, the better it's going to be, but also just for control decks to be able to ramp out their cards a little more quickly so they don't get overrun. So yeah, very solid card. I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Relic of Progenitus. It's a colorless for an artifact. You can tap it to make target player exile a card from his or her graveyard, or pay 1, exile it to exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card. So it's great against decks that are taking advantage of their graveyard. So against a deck that's really focused on a Reanimator, this is going to cause them a lot of trouble. I mean, you're going to want to use it every turn, make them exile a card from their graveyard, so that you might not have to actually pay the mana and exile it whenever they go for whatever their combo is. But yeah, it also removes flashback cards, gets rid of Threshold, though it does do that to yourself as well, so it becomes a little weaker as a sideboard card if you're trying to rely on those cards yourself, though you can still just use it to exile your opponent's cards 1 by 1, that might be good enough, and then try to get your flashback cards out of the yard before you actually exile it. But since it's a sideboard card that actually cycles for 2 mana, it's also not terrible to play in the main, though I mean, if you're an aggressive deck, I wouldn't do that. But yeah, I'd prefer to just leave this in the board, and it can be a very nice sideboard card, but you could also play it in the main, so I'm going to give it a C-. Next we have Sensei's Divining Top. It's one colorless artifact. Pay 1, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order, or you could tap, draw a card, then put top on top of its owner's library. So definitely gets better with shuffling effects, so you can just top, a lot of times you'll top on your upkeep, or just draw a card and play your hand out, leave up a mana, top at the end of your opponent's turn. But with shuffle effects, you get to wait until you draw the good cards off your deck, until there's 2 cards that you don't need, shuffle, and then you get to see a fresh 3 cards. So it's not quite drawing cards, but it gives you a lot better card selection and helps you plan out your turns better. So if you have shuffling effects, and there are some good ones, Shoreline Ranger, Twisted Abomination, Civic Wayfinder are some, also Squadron Hawk, then the card can be really strong. Being able to get the shuffling effect with top makes it very powerful. If you don't have these shuffling effects, I still think it's a good card. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, it's not good without shuffling effects, just like they say with Brainstorm. But as a good player, being able to see 3 cards into your deck, rearrange them, and then plan out your turns accordingly is actually really, really good. You're going to be, more cards deeper at finding a removal spell for your opponent's threat, and you can just sequence your turns out. You can make sure you have the land that you need on the right turn, and then you can always just tap the top to draw a card, and you didn't really lose much because you're just 1 card deeper. It's like you didn't even have to spend a card on the top. One last thing you can do is you can activate the look at top 3 cards ability, and in response use top to switch it with the top card, and then you can look at your top 3 cards, one of which will be top, and you can put top wherever you want it. Sometimes that's useful. So I think top not as good in very aggressive decks that you just want to curve out, and it is a little disruptive to have to spend mana in the early turns for those decks. But in more controlling decks, I think it's just a very good card, even if you don't have shuffling effects, but better if you do. So I'm going to give top a B-. Next we have Ticking Gnomes, 3 colorless artifact creature. It's a 3/3 with Echo 3 mana, and you can sacrifice it to deal 1 damage to a creature or player. So for Gnomes, you're going to pay 6 mana for 3/3 that can sacrifice to deal 1 damage to a creature or player. That's really bad. Yeah, you're paying it over 2 turns, and you can just pay it for 3, maybe chump something and then sack it to deal a damage to kill something. That could be pretty good. Yeah, just on its own as an actual creature, that's such a big investment for not a great body and not a great effect. So I think maybe its best use is just if your opponent has a very aggressive deck and you're afraid of dying early, just be able to play this on turn 3 and be a roadblock while trading with one of your opponent's cards, hopefully. But yeah, not a card I like. I'm going to give it a D. Next we have Winter Orb, 2 colorless artifacts. As long as it's untapped, players can't untap more than 1 land during their untap steps. So this is a very powerful card, hard to set up well, and if things don't go as you planned, it can be the end of you as well. It is a balanced card, but you choose when to throw it down, and there are some cards that can make it better or worse. So it tends to play best in aggro decks, so you play a couple creatures out, your opponent tries to stunt your early damage, maybe plays a big creature to block, and you play Winter Orb, leaving up a couple mana. So your opponent tapped out, now they have 1 mana, if they have a land in their hand they have 2 mana, but you're going to have access to more mana and have cheaper spells to play. Your opponent's going to have a bunch of expensive stuff, and maybe they'll have game lands that come into play tapped, which are basically useless, since your opponent's only untapping 1 land anyway. Yeah, it can be extremely powerful and can really shut you out of a game. On the other hand, it is matchup dependent, because if your opponent has Llanowar Elves, they can use that every turn, so they're going to have an extra mana on you each turn. And if you're behind, Winter Orb is probably just going to lose you the game, because you're going to need to spend your mana to recover. Yeah, it takes a very specific situation for you to win with it, but it is very, very powerful in that situation. And the more aggressive you are, the more mana creatures you have, or artifact mana, or if you have a Planeswalker or Hondens, some way to get incremental advantage without spending mana each turn, then the card can be extremely powerful. But just for the general card's sake, I'm going to give it a C+. Our last artifact is Worn Power Stone. It's 3 colorless artifact, enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it for 2 colorless mana. So you play turn 3, on turn 4 you have access to 6 mana if you play a land. So it's a card that adds 2 mana by itself, which is nice. It's a great card in Cube, but just like with Mana Crypt, I just don't think there's that much great stuff to ramp into in this format. Maybe your deck has it. There are some nice 7-drops, like Phyrexian Jester, there's Maelstrom Wanderer, Sphinx of the Steel Wind, but there's just not that much to ramp into. Now, you don't necessarily need to have to be able to ramp into one big card for a card like this to be good. So I don't want to discount that. Sometimes just having the extra 2 mana on your turn, it allows you to cast 2 things per turn. And so you shouldn't just look at it on like what you can actually ramp out on turn 4 or 5 with it. But I just feel like having extra colorless mana doesn't accomplish too much in this format. So while it's a very powerful card, I also don't think it's that great of a fit. I think a lot of the powerful cards are in the 3 and 4 mana range, and the games just end up kind of grindy. So having access to extra colorless mana I don't feel like really gives you wins that often. So not a big fan of it in this format. If you have some great things to ramp into, or you have some mana sinks, which there aren't too many of in this format, then I think Power Stone is going to be a very powerful card, but generally something I'm not looking to pick up too high, so I'm going to give it a C+. Okay, on to the lands. We are almost done with this review. So we're going to start with all the gain lands. So let's go Bloodfell Caves. It comes into play tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life, and you can tap it for a red and a black. And there's one of these lands for all 10 2-color combinations, and they're at common. And gaining the extra life means that coming to play tapped is not as big of a hindrance. If you play a few of these, yeah, you might be able to cast a card. You might be forced to cast a card a turn late, but you'll have gained a couple life, and so that balances out a decent amount of the negative factor of playing tap lands in your deck, which is very significant normally, but I feel like it's not that big here. And having access to 10 gain lands during the draft means that if you want to draft 4 or 5 colors, you can definitely do it. Every pack of the draft is either going to have a really good card for your archetype, well, not your archetype, just a very objectively powerful card, and then if it doesn't, you'll have some gain land. And you'll probably get a variety of different ones, and so you'll end up having a pretty good mana base. You can get 7 of them relatively easily, and then you can cast pretty much anything. Now, these lands really allow you to play 3 colors, 4 colors, 5 colors pretty easily, and the more controlling you are, the more likely you're going to want to play these, because coming into play tapped does suck for aggressive decks. So for red-white tokens decks that are very aggressive, I wouldn't even play one of the Windscarred Crags. But in most aggro decks, I'd probably run at least one. The more 1-drops you have, if you're going to curve 1, 2, 3, 4, then you might just not want to run any. But I think these cards are good enough to allow like Bloodbraid Elf to be splashed into green-black Elves decks. And so even decks that are relatively aggressive, I feel like you can make a splash using these lands. So they're very important cards in the format, and I think depending on your deck archetype, you're going to take them more highly or not take them at all. But I think C+ gives you a good idea of where you should be taking them. If you are controlling and you need the mana fixing, then you actually need to take them a lot higher. But I think C+ is a good estimate for their general value. Next we have Karakas. It's a legendary land that taps for a white. You can tap it to return target legendary creature to its owner's hand. So this is strictly better than a Plains if you run 1, so there's just no cost to putting this in your deck if you're white. So it could have a very, very small effect, and this would still be a nice card to pick up, considering you're replacing a land slot, so like you're 100% sure you're playing this card when you pick in the draft. And like, let's see what is the ability? Return target legendary creature to its owner's hand by tapping it. That's an extremely powerful ability, but it depends on how many legends there are in the format. There are some legends in the format, not a ton. I feel like the average deck is not going to have a legend. There are the Pit Lord legends that each color gets. There's Maelstrom Wanderer, Brago. I'm not going to go through the whole set to see exactly how many there are, but there's not that many, so Krakus isn't coming up too often. But if you do have a legendary creature in your deck, then Krakus can protect it. You just leave it up, and if your opponent uses removal spell on it, you just protect it with Krakus. So it goes great with Brago or Visara. Just gives you an unstoppable combo. Like, if you have Visara and leave Krakus up, you're probably never going to lose a game. And also is just insane if your opponent has one of those cards, just completely blanks it. So if they have Visara, your land that is as good as a Plains completely blanks their A quality card. Now, if you're playing live, you're probably taking the Krakus for the value. Online, it's a lot easier to come up with them, so it's not worth that much online. So, where should you actually pick it? It's hard to say because generally you're not actually getting value from it. It's sort of rare that the ability is going to come up. If you already have a legendary creature, I think that Krakus is a high pick, something I would first pick. But if you don't, depending on your opponent's having legendary creatures, there's not enough that it's going to come up too often. But it's also just so nice to have that extra little ability on top of a card that's strictly better than a Plains. So I would take it at the C+ range. So not over a card that you're happy to put in your deck that you know you're going to play, but definitely over any filler or even just solid cards. So I'm going to give it a C+. And next up we have one of my favorite and most underrated cards in the entire set, Maze of Ith. It's a land, it does not add mana, you can tap it to untap target attacking creature, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by that creature this turn. So this card does a lot of interesting things. The most obvious is your opponent attacks with some number of creatures, you use Maze of Ith on the creature that's dealing the most damage, and you prevent that damage to yourself. So if you're playing a defensive game, it can act like a passivism on your opponent's best creature. And even better than passivism potentially is the fact that you can switch it every single turn. So your opponent plays a better creature, now you maze that creature. And you can still use whatever removal that you have that best hits whatever creature your opponent has. You can just keep using that and then using maze on the one thing that you can't deal with. And for that ability alone, in control decks, especially decks that grind out an advantage, so in a deck with Hondens, this card is amazing. Now, it takes a land drop to play, but it doesn't cost any mana. So if you're going to play Maze in your deck, you're going to treat it as a spell. There is a disability that to play Maze, you're not playing a land for the turn, so you're going to fall a little bit behind. But the thing is, falling a turn behind on playing a land is totally fine if you're neutralizing the best creature your opponent has on the board. So you're not going to feel like you're falling behind. You're going to feel like you're actually getting ahead. And Maze has a lot of other applications too. So if your opponent goes for a pump spell, you can use Maze and basically fizzle the pump spell. It allows you to go for double blocks in your opponent's creature, and if your opponent uses a pump spell, you just Maze and they lose a card. And if not, you just let the damage happen, and maybe they have to make a bad trade. And this ability is so powerful in these grindy games in this format that I've had matches where I can basically deck my opponent using Maze of Ith. A lot of decks don't have that many ways of actually finishing a game out. They might have just a few large flying creatures, like a blue-black control deck, and Maze of Ith just neutralizes their biggest threat. You can use whatever small removal you have to deal with their Mana Wars and Gravediggers, and sometimes they just can't beat you. But what you might not realize is that the card actually has some great applications in decks that are attacking. While it's not the best card in like a red-white tokens deck, you can use it on offense. So you attack with multiple creatures, your opponent has a big blocker, they block your best creature to eat it, you can use Maze to untap your creature and prevent the damage dealt to it. So it lets you get in damage without actually losing a creature. So that's pretty cool. And lastly, it also lets you put combat damage on the stack, or excuse me, it lets you resolve combat damage. We don't have combat damage on the stack anymore. But it lets you resolve combat damage, and then, at the end of combat, untap your creature that you attacked with. So if you have like a really large creature, you can attack with it, deal the damage, and then untap it, basically giving it a type of vigilance. So you add up all these different things that the card can do, and it's a colorless card. So it can go in any deck, and it costs 0 mana. Like, yes, I understand you're missing a land drop, but it costs 0 mana. And what that does for your opening hands is, like, if you mulligan into a hand with a Maze of Ith, you can... I've kept hands with just, 1 island, a Maze of Ith, and 3 drops. And Maze of Ith is going to buy you so much time that you're eventually just going to draw your lands. Like, stopping your opponent's biggest creature every single turn, and you don't have to pay mana for it. So yeah, Maze of Ith is actually an insane card. It's a great first pick because it can go into basically any deck. I do think that some of the red-white tokens decks, super aggressive decks, might want to not play it. They might have something better to run. But yeah, it just goes in so many decks, so I'm going to give Maze an A. Oh, and one more thing, it's also really hard to kill. They need like a Vindicate, Passivism, they can bounce the creature, get it back. Maze is just going to sit and play for the rest of the game, causing problems for your opponent. So yeah, giving Maze an A. Next up is Mishra's Factory. It's a land that taps for colorless. You can pay 1 to make it a 2/2 assembly worker, artifact creature until on a turn. It's still a land. You can tap it, target assembly worker, gets +1/+1 until on a turn. So if you have multiple factories, they can pump each other, but typically you can use that ability on defense, so it can block as a 3/3 or it attacks as a 2/2. So the downside to the card is that it only taps for colorless mana, so if your deck is very color intensive, then I'm not going to run this card. But it's really great in aggressive decks. It just lets you get extra damage out of your lands. If you have just 2 mana left over on a turn, you can poke in for 2 damage. So yeah, really nice to have in aggressive decks. I typically like to just play it in decks that are 2 colors, so I'm not too punished by running the colorless land. But it's also decent enough just to run in any deck, because it's a land that adds mana, but then can trade with one of your opponent's creatures at some point. So yeah, just a solid card, but I like to just stick it in decks that are 2 or less colors. But I'm going to give Factory a C+. And our last card of the review, and the card that you may hope to open, and I hope you do, is Wasteland. It's a land, you can tap it for colorless mana, tap sack it to destroy target non-basic land. So, great card in Constructed. What does it do in Limited? It's a colorless land, so it's rough if you're trying to run multiple colors, but it hits the non-basic lands in the format. We just went over them. It can kill a Maze of Ith, which is great. But otherwise, it can be good against the gain lands. The average deck is going to run at least 1 gain land, so it'll frequently have targets. And some of the 5-color decks are going to run as many as 7 or 8 gain lands, and it's going to be a great card against them, helping to keep them off their colors, or just apply more pressure if you get some creatures out and you take them back a whole turn on their development. So yeah, it's actually a pretty good card in this format. You're probably picking it online or in real life just for the money value, but I think it's a card that you could actually play in the main deck in more aggressive decks, so I'm going to give it a C. Okay, so that does it for my Eternal Masters set review. This was a huge undertaking, took many hours of work to put this together. I hope that you got a lot out of it. I apologize for taking so long to get this to you. But this is something that I would like to do in the future. Please let me know in the comments what you thought of the review, anything you'd like to change, if you feel like there's a way that I can get this information to you in a better format, if you'd like to have maybe another person on doing this with me, might keep it more interesting. Yeah, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you, because I would like to do something this in depth for some of the new sets coming out, like Eldritch Moon. So let me know if you're interested in this, and I thank you so much for making it through this whole series. I hope it helps both. I hope it both helps you to draft this format, but also to understand card evaluation and some general concepts about limited as well. So thank you so much, and I will see you next time.